We'll be discussing Moff Gideon's lightsaber or Darksaber technique on today's Star Wars video. Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. Today we'll be examining the fighting style of Moff Gideon during his duel with Din Djarin, specifically trying to answer the question of which lightsaber style did Gideon employ. Now, the idea for today's video actually comes from my friend the AT-AT Chat, who runs a really great YouTube channel. He will be doing an even more in-depth look at how Gideon fights. He's done battle breakdowns in the past, which are really interesting. I'm going to link one down in the pinned comment. Make sure to check that out, and while you're there, subscribe so you can catch his video as it drops, because let's be honest, I pretty much stole his idea. Anyway, the way I want to structure this video is, first of all, I'm going to take a look at each individual lightsaber style or form, as they're sometimes called. Then at the end, we'll look more at Gideon specifically and also examine the rest of the lore to see if we can figure out which style he's using, if any. A lot of you are already really familiar with the lightsaber style, so if you want to skip that part of the video, you can use the scroll bar down below to find the chapter of the video that you are interested in. With that being said, let's get started. So, lightsaber styles or forms were basically different sets of fighting moves used by the Jedi, the Sith, and others who routinely use a lightsaber in Star Wars Legends and canon. Different lightsaber forms emphasize different aspects of combat, so as we'll see in a second, some forms are far more defensive, others are aggressive, and for that reason, combatants would often be attracted to a single form which they would then master depending on their natural skill set. However, others would naturally move between different forms, which made them fairly unpredictable during combat. The best discussion of lightsaber forms, I would say, in Star Wars Legends comes from the Darth Bane novel, and presumably most of what's in there also applies, at least conceptually, to Star Wars canon. Darth Bane, for example, was competent in several forms but preferred Form 5 because it was most effective given his very large build and extreme strength. We'll very briefly now run over the forms. Form 1 is the most basic of the lightsaber forms and the oldest. Because of its simplicity, it wasn't generally used by more advanced fighters. Form 2, Mukashi, was dedicated to perfecting combat against an individual opponent, a true dueling form, while Form 3, conversely, was much better at defending in any situation. Sorisu, as it was called, was great at helping to deflect blasters, and as mentioned, was almost purely defensive with a focus on tiring an enemy out and forcing them into mistakes. This was a form used by Bane's apprentice Xana, who with her double-sided lightsaber could basically offer an impenetrable defense, forcing the enemy to eventually get frustrated and put themselves in a bad situation. Form 4, known as Ataru, was offensive and focused on speed, whereas Form 5, Gemso, was also fairly offensive but instead placed the burden on an individual's strength. Form 6 was a balanced form often used by Jedi, and perhaps the most famous lightsaber form was 7, also known as Vipad. Vipad basically used the Force to fuel lightsaber combat and could be described as reckless and aggressive. So you can kind of see how some of these forms fit together. A Form 3 user, for example, may have an advantage against a Vipad user if they can hold off the onslaught long enough for their enemy to become exhausted and make a mistake. So knowing all of that and examining the fight, what lightsaber form did Moff Gideon employ? Some we can immediately exclude. Vipad, because he's not force sensitive. Forms 2 and 3, because he was not a defensive fighter. Form 4, because he didn't rely on speed. That's leaving Form 6, the balanced form, Form 5, Gemso, and Form 1, the basic form. So while the obvious option seems Gemso because of Gideon's aggressiveness, there's something I haven't quite explained. Lightsaber forms are more than just simply how you fight. So just because you're aggressive does not necessarily mean that you fall into Gemso, or because you're defensive that you fall into Form 3. What's important is that a lightsaber form gives you an arsenal of moves and maneuvers to use against your enemies. Truly understanding a lightsaber form is more than just a state of mind. It's everything from how you hold a lightsaber, to the individual moves you learn, to basically being able to fight without consciously thinking. We see in the Bane book that before even attempting to learn a lightsaber style, that fighters first learn basic moves, the sort of fundamental aspects of all of these forms, and then as they learn an individual form and get a bit more specific in their fighting style, they then move on to practicing and developing a combat combat routine. These routines have set moves and combinations, and again, all of this is so that you can fight in combat without having to think. So especially for Force users, you can fall back into Gemso or Soresu or whatever else, and your mind can be free to use the Force and try to gain an advantage mentally. If we actually look at Moff Gideon, he doesn't fight like you would expect to given any of these forms. Gideon's style of fighting is very basic. It's two-handed, wide swings. He doesn't show any economy of motion, and really his strategy relies on an incredibly aggressive set of attacks before his opponent can settle himself. Once there's actual combat involved, Gideon isn't able to do anything really besides pressing an attack, and once the Mandalorian gets his staff ready, it's basically over. Gideon doesn't really counter or parry, he sometimes blocks attacks. Something like Form 5 would have allowed him to more easily transition to defense and then, when he was given the moment, return to his offense. Something like Form 6 would never allow such a reckless attack, especially given the fact that Gideon has no armor and is fighting a Beskar-clad Mandalorian. Form 1, similarly, if practiced properly, would not have that onslaught and certainly would have allowed Gideon to fall back into at least a competent defense, and just generally would have involved a lot more balance. So, which lightsaber form is Moff Gideon using here? None of them. Gideon is clearly not a trained duelist, or at least is not trained to the competency level of anywhere near even a Jedi Padawan. He doesn't have the practiced repetitive motion of a duelist, he doesn't have the Force to aid his combat, so when Mandalorian actually gets a chance to fight him with his staff, it's a pretty easy battle. When it comes to the Mandalorian generally, just his fighting style, he kind of reminds me of a Form 2 practitioner because he's often fighting overwhelming odds, but in this fight with Moff Gideon as well, he employs the sort of Form 3 style of waiting for his opponent to overextend, then makes him pay with one definitive set of moves. I will also note, and we see this in the Bane book as well, that fighting a user with a double-sided staff is much different than a traditional blade, and even if Moff Gideon were trained in a specific style, this could have been difficult for him because when you've memorized and worked all these moves into your muscle memory, even slight changes can throw you off, and this is why Bane used a curved hilt to try to throw off practiced duelists. But guys, that's all I have for today. Let me know your thoughts on Gideon's fighting style down in the comments. And just a reminder that my friend @chat, who's also done a few videos for this channel, will be doing a full fight breakdown of the duel with Gideon, and is also doing a sort of Gideon week, where he'll be covering lots of aspects of the character. But guys, that's all for today. Before we end, I want to wish everybody a happy new year. Hopefully 2021 is a little bit easier than 2020. Until then though, have a good one, be safe, and may the Force be with you.